Hi everyone, my name is Rona Matthews and I'm the project manager for the dealership and fleet programs at the Center for Sustainable Energy. I will be moderating today's webinar. And first and foremost, I want to welcome you all to the last webinar in our webinar series, Tools and Techniques for Tracking Your Fleet Success. So I wanted to note that we'll be leaving time at the end of the presentations for questions, and we're asking that all attendees enter their questions into the question prompt in the webinar toolbar. Please enter questions into this prompt as they arise, and we'll address all of them at the end of the presentation. So we've muted all phone lines and will only be accepting questions submitted electronically. All right, and I did want to introduce today's speakers. So we have Casey Fallon, who's the Director of Purchasing, Warehouse, and Fleet with the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And then we also have Jacob Burks. He is the Manager for Fleet Operations, also with SMUD. And they will be diving into the meat and potatoes for tools and techniques, whereas I'll be providing the CVRP fleet information. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and dive into CVRP for fleet. And so I did want to show everyone this image and getting started on this PowerPoint. We do have the link to our fleet page, so you can always answer that. It's below the image. And I did want to note the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project promotes clean vehicle adoption in California by offering rebates up to $7,000 for the purchase or lease of new eligible zero-emission vehicles, including electric, plug-in hybrid, and fuel cell vehicles. The Center for I'm going to go ahead and refer to Center for Sustainable Energy as CSE, or else I'll keep fumbling over my words. So CSE administers CVRP throughout the state for the California Air Resources Board, otherwise known as CARB. CARB is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency, Cal EPA, and exists to promote and protect public health, welfare, and ecological resources through the effective and efficient reduction of air pollutants while recognizing and considering the effects on the economy of the state. CVRP's funding is determined by an annual funding plan that is developed with public input and approved by CARB. And on the next slide that we're going to be looking at, we really wanted to put this slide up here because we really wanted to show the two CARB incentives for fleet. So we have both CVRP and HVIP offer the incentives for fleets, and CVRP provides the light duty incentive, whereas HVIP provides the medium to heavy duty incentive. So there are 4 types of clean fuel vehicles that CVRP provides rebates for. We have plug-in hybrids, the full battery electric vehicles, and then we also have our fuel cell electric vehicles, but we also have zero emission motorcycles. So 2 things I want to note about these CVRP for public fleet rebates. Not all plug-ins are eligible for the rebate. So be sure to check the CVRP list of eligible vehicles found on our website and the model year to see which vehicles qualify for the rebate. I also wanted to note that public fleet vehicles are the only fleets eligible for the increased rebate amount that you'll see on the left-hand column under increased amount. And so CVRP uses the Cal EPA and Cal Enviro Screen 3.0. Wow, I cannot say lots of letters today. 3.0 tool to determine increased rebate eligibility. You can check to see if your fleet qualifies by entering the vehicle domicile address into the Cal Enviro Screen 3.0 tool, which is also found on our CVRP fleet website. And what I really want to note about fleet electrification is it's not an easy process. If you have any questions about infrastructure or where to get started, please reach out to me and I'm happy to answer any questions where I can. Our guest speakers today will also be diving into some things to know when you want to electrify vehicles, so please keep that in mind. And then the next slide, I did want to preface that because fleet electrification isn't just because it doesn't happen overnight, there are things that you need to consider and areas where things could potentially go wrong if you don't have a plan for that. And so we have identified 4 major issues we've seen with fleet electrification that could be avoided, like I said, with proper planning. So bricked vehicles. Bricked vehicles are essentially vehicles that are not being used or charged. And a solution that we've identified is you really have to train your staff. Some fleets like to prepare standard operating procedures and training manuals for their staff, as well as providing like an orientation when they have procured electric vehicles. We've also seen low utilization. And a solution that we've seen with that is some fleets will have fleet utilization tracking CRMs to make sure they're recording all of their vehicles and how often people are using them. And a solution that we've also identified with that is to just track the usage and then try to see where you can place these vehicles or where it makes sense within your staff. Another thing is driver behavior. Like most of these things, it needs to be training the staff. So make sure you have the resources to train staff that are going to be using these vehicles. And lastly, we see problems scaling up. So a solution that we've identified is try to address that with the proper infrastructure to support where you would like to take your fleet. So it does involve a lot of planning and thinking ahead and seeing, can your facility, how many vehicles or how much infrastructure can your facility support? And with that, like I said, if you have any questions, my contact information will be at the end. But I did want to remind you all that we will be answering questions after all the presentations. So please type your questions into the question prompts on the GoToWebinar toolbar. And so now I'm actually going to throw it over to Casey and Jacob from SMUD, who will now be discussing the tools and techniques they use to track their fleet success.
All right, thank you guys. This is Casey Fallon from SMUD. We're up here in Northern California in Sacramento. And we're excited about the opportunity to talk a little bit about how we measure and manage our fleet with a focus on KPIs, software utilization, and other measures. And like you described earlier, we'll talk about fleet electrification briefly. So just the picture here, just for a moment, this is one of the Chevy Bolts that we have in our fleet. Of course, it's all electric. We have a marketing campaign behind fleet electrification, and we had a lot of great support from our internal staff to put this campaign together. We drive electric, you can too. These are primarily commuter vehicles in our fleet that are used for our vehicle pool. So we'll come back to some fleet electrification, and again, just reiterating the focus of today's session, talking about fleet success, how to measure it, some KPIs, criteria, software that we use, and how we track everything really down to the cost and other critical factors. So for me and Jacob, I feel like it's a great opportunity just to kind of have a little bit of a conversation and tell you how we manage and measure our fleet. And hopefully you have lots of questions at the end, and you can certainly follow up with us through email and whatnot later. So before we dive into fleet, the next slide talks a little bit about who we are. If you're not familiar with SMUD, we are an electric utility in Northern California in Sacramento. The left-hand side shows our service territory. It's broken up into 7 different wards, and each of those wards is represented by a publicly elected board member. So we have an executive staff, and we have a publicly elected board that presides over our municipal utility. So our population in the service area is about 1.5 million people, about 900 square miles. We serve, of course, residential and business accounts. In total, just over 600,000. We have about 2,200 employees, over 10,000 lines of power lines, or 10,000 miles of power lines, I'm sorry. And over the years, as a utility in California, obviously, we've been very focused on reducing our carbon emitting resources. So we're over 50% at this point in our power profile. The next slide, I think, goes to introduce Jacob.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Jacob is our fleet manager. This is a snapshot of his LinkedIn profile. You should all go and connect with Jacob on LinkedIn. For me, similarly, LinkedIn profile. I'm the Director of Purchasing, Warehouse, and Fleet here at SMUD. 3 separate business units, but of course, fleet is the focus for today. I think we'll be jumping right into it. I think we already hit on most of this. Again, how we measure and manage our fleet, some KPIs, fleet electrification planning, and then some lessons learned and goals towards the end.
Okay. Thank you, Casey. So just a broad overview of the fleet in general. SMUD's fleet, we're a smaller utility, but still a very good size operation. We have about 980 vehicles, including our light, medium, and heavy duty off-road vehicles. Mainly all of our vehicles are housed and repaired, and they come back to one yard every night. We do have we have a total of 3 shops. We have the main shop at the ECOC, which is our East Campus Operations Center, and then up in the Sierra along Highway 50, we have what is called the Upper American River Project, where we have our hydro assets for electric generation, and up there we have 2 smaller shops that have about 116 vehicles up there. We still have Rancho Seco. Rancho Seco is a retired, decommissioned nuclear facility, and we do have a very small fleet of vehicles out there as well that we maintain. So the replacement value of our fleet is about $75 million. Our average fleet age is about 9.5, almost 10 years. Our annual fuel spend is about $2 million. Operating maintenance is about $4 million, and currently our replacement budget is about $8 million, which changes depending on various budget constraints. So just like any fleet, we manage our fleet and make decisions on replacing vehicles and equipment based off the age, the miles, the application, utilization. And currently today, we have about 12% of our total fleet that is some kind of electric application, whether it be electric forklift, a fully electric vehicle, or vehicles that include some sort of hybrid technology involved with it. But we'll get into some of that a little bit later as we get through the presentation.
Before we go to the next slide, do you want to talk briefly about kind of the org chart and the total number of staff on your team?
Yeah. So we have, I'm the manager of fleet operations, and then we have, we're broken up into 2 main areas. We have procurement, which is a vehicle speccing, engineering, designing, kind of a group of guys, small group of guys that manages the purchasing and the build of vehicles. And then we have a maintenance supervisor who manages we have about 20 mechanics and a welder. And we do most of our maintenance, probably about 90% of our maintenance we do in-house. So that's kind of the breakout of the fleet in general. So.
Awesome. The next slide, I think, just splits out the fleet in terms of focus areas. And for each of these areas, we do have specific criteria and measures and reporting and goals. So just in brief, do you want to talk about how the fleet breaks out in these areas?
Sure. So like I said at the beginning, we spend about $1.9 million a year on fuel. It's a tremendous expense for us, and we currently use primarily renewable diesel fuel in our fleet. We've been using that successfully for about the last 2 years. And our rentals and leases, we rent and lease about $500,000 worth of equipment throughout the year. Anything from a backhoe, something we get at United Rentals, or it could be a specialized piece of equipment for line work. So we try to keep a pretty tight lid on that, because we do know that it affects our cost and the utilization of our overall fleet. So we also look at that very closely to see we can do for instance, we can do a study over the last 2 or 3 years and look at the frequency of what types of equipment we're renting and what we're spending, and that we can do, build a business case and do some analysis and decide whether or not it's worth actually just purchasing that piece of equipment. So we manage that on a regular basis. Damage, most of our vehicles, they're on the road daily. So we have in-house, we have a body shop and a paint booth, and we have one full-time body and paint man. And unfortunately, it happens, but we do have probably, several accidents, a year, sometimes several a month, sometimes even several in a week, sometimes a couple in a given day. It just depends. But unfortunately, that's one of the liabilities that we try to manage as best as we can. And we try to do, through various aspects. We have driver training programs. We have technology on the vehicles, backup cameras, things of that sort to try to curb that as best as we can. Maintenance, every fleet has maintenance, whether it's corrective or preventative. We try to keep our preventative maintenance, above 90% caught up. And those two things really help and lead to our customer satisfaction so that the crews can perform their work and that they have a reliable tool to do their job. Capital, again, we're spending currently about $8 million a year. It's a bit, every vehicle, every build can be a project in and of itself, especially if it is a customized piece of utility equipment. A single line truck can run to the tune of $480,000. So there's some really big projects, and so we try to manage those dollars. A lot of those vehicles and custom vehicles have lead times up to 400 days. So we try to manage, between the cost and the lead time, and then keep the vehicles that we have, already here and running. So we're always juggling. I think that, SMUD does a great job. We're kind of that mid-sized utility where a lot of people in fleet wear a lot of different hats. So it can be challenging at times, but I think we have a pretty good team. Projects, they come, they go. Currently, a big project for us is fleet electrification. It's one that's definitely here to stay. So we're going to get into that further in this presentation. You got anything you want to add?
No, I think we can go to the next slide, and then I'll kind of tee that up with a few things. So shifting gears from the focus areas of the fleet that Jacob mentioned, I'm sure that those areas are familiar to all the fleet operators and fleet managers on the line. And I wanted to shift the focus to how do we measure our progress, how do we measure our success, and how do we recognize all of those good outcomes week to week or month to month and year over year. And I've had responsibility for our fleet operation for almost 6 years now, in the director role for 4.5, 5 years, and I was a fleet manager previously for not quite a year. But I feel like we have a great story to tell. Jacob's done an incredible job managing the fleet over the last few years, and we have built a scorecard to measure those successes. And just to kind of distill it down, I thought I would mention how we do that initially. So we are using SAP, our ERP system, and we use the plant maintenance module to keep track of all of our fleet equipment as assets and all the expenses that go along with maintaining the fleet. Within that PM module in SAP, we have all of our maintenance attached to those assets, inspections, etc., and everything is operating there in SAP. So that system can be fairly cumbersome at times. I hope there's a few people on the line that are kind of feeling our pain on that. We have not made an investment in a web-based or a fleet-specific work management system. We've thought a lot about that over the last couple of years, but we're really just trying to find the right time and develop a good business case for that investment, we're thinking it would probably be anywhere between a couple $100,000 up to maybe $1 million. So we're trying to narrow that range on the business case before making that type of investment. So in the meantime, we are measuring our success, and we are keeping track of how we manage the fleet by extracting information from SAP and putting it onto scorecards or weekly metrics. And just to start with, kind of high level, to show you how our scorecard breaks out, there's 4 quadrants. The upper left corner is the financial information, so our expenses against plan, monthly, year to date, and then forecasted at year end. And we give ourselves a couple years back and a couple years into the future to see the trend. Same idea on the lower left. We just focus on our staffing, the number of resources or the labor that we have. And the lower right, those are the projects that we're keeping track of month to month. And then the upper right-hand corner, which is where we'll spend most of our time with a couple examples and listing out what some of those metrics are. Those are our key performance indicators, really. And we measure those on a monthly basis and use a scorecard so that Jacob and I can stay on the same page, so that I am able to report up to our executive team as needed on the health and performance of the fleet. Or just share those outcomes or successes with our staff or with the business units that we're supporting. So again, this is our scorecard for fleet, and we're going to spend most of the time in the metrics or KPI section in the upper right-hand corner. Just one other thought on having a scorecard and the routine that we've built. Depending on where you are in your effort to manage, track, maintain data in your systems, and setting goals for fleet, it can be a challenge to get all the right data together and all the right reporting and the routine. But over the last couple of years, we've really just built this routine based on a couple of simple questions just to keep us focused and able to report the information out regularly. And those 3 questions are really the same for any aspect of the fleet, whether it's fuel expense or our backlog of maintenance or our utilization. And the first one is, where have we been? So the last couple of years or prior months. Where are we now? And then the last question, of course, where are we going to be, or where do we need to be? So just framing that up allows us to track our activity, our successes, and set goals into the future. So that's a little bit of the structure on our scorecard. I think the next slide just lists out the KPIs, and we can probably just hit a couple of these, but these are kind of the main trackable KPIs for our fleet. You want to talk about a couple of these, Jacob?
Yeah, so we look at utilization. Vehicle utilization is very important to us. We use it to right-size the fleet. And generally speaking, we view our pieces of equipment as rolling. A lot of them are rolling toolboxes. So we don't measure utilization based off of miles or anything like that. We use it off of, we measure it off of days used. So if it's 1 in 5, then it's 20% for that week. That's how we look at that. We use Verizon Network Fleet to track our key starts, and that's what tells us what our utilization is. So we measure our backlog of work orders, aging maintenance, preventative maintenance, fleet capital, new assets coming in, going out. How many vehicles are we receiving new? How many are we sending to auction? We keep track of our regulatory maintenance, whether it's a smog check or a snap idle test or an aerial inspection, or a crane inspection. We track the fleet size. We do keep track of our miles driven. We like to see miles driven, our maintenance cost per mile, and we track our fuel economy, gallons consumed. We track our number of GPS units not working. With a fleet of our size, 980 units, there's roughly on any given day probably about 35 to 45 GPS units that have some kind of issue that needs to be addressed. So that's just kind of ongoing. It's part of the nature of the beast. And then we're starting to track this year and more heavily our idling hours, and we're identifying some opportunities where we can reduce the carbon footprint by reducing our idling, not to mention just the maintenance and the fuel spend and whatnot that goes along with idling. So here's an example of our fleet. You can see some of the categories that are broken up on the left: forklifts, heavy duty, medium duty. These are just some of the different vehicle classes that we have, and then the breakout of our fleet by vehicle class. And then you can see from 2015 up until this year, you can see how that has changed over the years. So it fluctuates a little bit, but we're really happy to see that it's static. If you do go back to 2012, 13, 14, and 15, I think we were up at one time around almost close to 1,300 units. So we have brought the size of the fleet down quite a bit just in the last 5 or 6 years. This one here has, this is the same thing, but it's broken out our vehicles, vehicle class, and then the age of that class by vehicle. So we all know that our maintenance costs are driven a lot to do with the age of the vehicle, a lot of wear and tear on the vehicle. So this kind of helps us to keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on with our fleet. Generally, as vehicles become older, the maintenance cost goes up, and the customer becomes more unhappy, and the work gets interrupted. So it depends on the vehicle class individually as to what that target's going to be. Trailers and whatnot, we're pretty comfortable running those for a long period of time. You can see recently we had a pretty large purchase and replaced several trailers, but generally speaking, as a whole, we're shooting to bring the age of the fleet down to about 9 years.
And this is a great slide. I know there's a lot of numbers on here, and I tend to be a fan of numbers and spreadsheets rather than fancy graphs and things. But if you think about how to manage a fleet as a model, where you have an asset base, just kind of the traditional asset-based management model. You've got, like Jacob said earlier, $75 million replacement fleet. It takes a certain amount of care and feeding of that fleet to keep it running, and we have to make a certain amount of investment per year in that fleet to keep it at the same condition or improve the condition. And what we realized a few years ago is that our fleet was aging and had a lower condition in certain areas of the fleet. Some of the heavy duty, some of the construction equipment, and then some of our pickups, for example. So we specifically targeted those areas that had a higher maintenance cost or more breakdowns, invested in those categories. And this average age of our fleet, it just gives us an indicator whether we're headed in the right direction, along with improvements to our maintenance costs and things. So just to call out a couple lines, you can see off-road construction equipment over the year, we've reduced the average age from 2018 now here in recent weeks to less than 10 years by taking older equipment out of the fleet and replacing it with something new. We're fortunate to have a healthy fleet capital budget allocated each year, but we had to go and request additional fleet capital dollars back in 2015 when we realized that our fleet compared to some benchmarking studies for other utilities, was really aging in certain areas. So our strategy was to go out, get the additional budget dollars. We were able to do that and then invest it in the right areas. And this just demonstrates how the age has been coming down and measuring that we're headed in the right direction. I think the next slide is similar, but this is focused on our work orders and the whole maintenance routine.
So this is our this is a indicator of the backlog of work orders that we have, and our work orders are broken down into several different categories. We have corrective maintenance at the top, preventative maintenance in the middle. This is our 90-day bit inspections, oil changes, and down below we have our regulatory. So we have it broken out, 340, 341, 342. It just indicates whether or not it's a smog, a snap idle, a rope inspection. So across the board, this gives us an opportunity to work with the guys out on the shop floor. It gives them an indication where they're at. Again, it tells a story in your maintenance cost. PM currency is a good example. As your PM currency goes up, you're spending more money. In preventative maintenance, you're going to see fewer breakdowns and emergency maintenance and those types of things. But this has been a great tool for the guys out in the shop to show them where they're at, to set some goals with them, and improve the overall efficiency and kind of drive in the shop. So this is a really good tool that we use on a weekly basis that helps everybody to know where we're at, how we're performing. This slide is just a snapshot of our fleet capital, how we track it, and it's very basic. We have a plan. We're already pretty much filled up for 2020, and we've decided and evaluated what we're going to purchase. So we'll map out the dollars in what months we think that the vehicle is going to be delivered, and that we're able to pay for it and spend the money that we promised to spend, and no more, no less. We do the best that we can with that. Now, in our industry, we do a great deal of time working with vendors and having quarterly business reviews with them, monthly meetings, keeping us up to date. Sometimes there's delays. Sometimes chassis manufacturers have delays and shortages, and it can be quite complex and daunting to get a vehicle delivered on time. So this is just a slide that outlines that. It's pretty basic. So utilization, overall, along the top line, you can see our fleet utilization as a whole. And we use Verizon Network Fleet to measure the utilization. And then down below, I just put in that snapshot that these are our line trucks, and these are the days utilized on average so far through July. So you can see that these vehicles, how many days on average per month that they get used. And this is working business days. So a lot of our trucks, some of our key trucks have fairly high utilization, and they go up, in and out of the yard every day, and they have to run a lot of our fleet. The vehicles have to be able to respond. They're considered, first responders. They need to be able to operate 24/7, 365 days a year. So it's also a good tool when right-sizing the fleet. When we work with other business groups, we can sit down with them and we can show them, hey, this truck has not been used for 5 or 6 months or a year, or it's only been used twice. I think it's time to retire it. Is there any other options? So we like to stay as lean and mean as possible in the fleet. So these kind of utilization reports are great for having those conversations. Sometimes vehicles can be very personal to people, very personal to the operators, and even though they don't use them, they don't like to give them up. So we try to use this as a tool to pry it out of their hands sometimes. So
one other success measure that's somewhat informal that we like to have fun with within our fleet is when we're negotiating for those trades or those new vehicles to do replacements. I always like to hear from Jacob and the team about where they were able to negotiate a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1. So as we're implementing one new piece of equipment, we're getting 2 back or 3 back, and being resourceful and thoughtful about that, we've been able to really keep the overall size of our fleet the same, month to month and year over year, just drawing out some of that older, underutilized equipment to be either repurposed or taken out of the fleet altogether. Next slide, I think it starts in on fleet electrification. Do you want to talk about this one?
Sure.
Or want to jump in?
So again, just like the slide that showed individual vehicle class and age, this is individual vehicle class percent electrified. So the good one that we'll talk about is like our light duty sedans. This year we achieved 100% electrification of our light duty sedans. We have about 53 sedans. So that was something exciting for us. But just each individual vehicle class and the percentage of it that is electrified is what this explains, and it tells us where we were and where we are now, and we have some goals that aren't on this slide that we'll get to for the future.
And it's highly unlikely that we'll have an electric option for an 85-foot aerial or a line truck, for example, but just to keep the measure simple for our whole organization, because we do report this out broadly. Everybody knows the size of our fleet is about 1,000 pieces of equipment, vehicles and equipment together. So if we're just measuring the percent of those vehicles and equipment in total that have some sort of electric option, just kind of keeps it simple. If we start getting into the semantics or the debate of what has the potential to have an electric or a hybrid option, then we start slicing and dicing our fleet, and it's harder to measure our progress or really demonstrate that we're moving in the right direction. So we just decided to really just try to keep it simple and just show the whole fleet and highlight the areas where there are opportunities and show where we're moving the mark. The next slide. Maybe something we could have started with, but this is just a picture of our East Campus Operations Center. The parking looks a little bit sparse. This is during the day, but generally this is where about 2/3 of our fleet is parked. We're very fortunate to have one main operations center where all of our crews and most of our field forces show up and head out for the day. So that's just kind of a picture of the yard.
One thing I just want to point out is, if you guys notice, we have this nice big concrete pad that everything parks on. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit later when it comes to charging infrastructure. But we actually have underneath that parking lot a 750,000 gallon water tank where we capture all the storm water for all the vegetation on the facility. So, but that's going to come into key as you plan for electrification. And I bring that up because everybody's location is going to be different, and everybody's location is going to have separate issues and challenges when it comes to installing charging infrastructure. And this water tank underneath the slab that hopefully you guys can visualize there was one of ours. So.
And then just one point, that building in the far end of the picture in the back there, you can probably see the little orange letters that says fleet support. That's our main garage for the company, where everything is serviced, and that team that Jacob mentioned, they all reside there. So I'm going to kind of step back a little bit from fleet and talk about what Jacob and I saw coming a few years ago. We had always made modest investments in fleet electrification, but certainly being in California utility, there was a lot of discussion about how to reduce our emissions and align with state and other regional goals. And what Jacob and I talked about as fleet operators is how can we get ahead of this and demonstrate that we're looking to align to some of these goals and set our own goals and targets for our fleet so that we can be more in no pun intended, in the driver's seat in terms of fleet electrification, because what we really wanted to avoid was not having the right amount of activity or investments where we would be given a mandate maybe from our publicly elected board or from senior leadership that thought, we should be moving the mark at a certain pace, or we should be comparing to other utilities or other agencies in the region. We really wanted to just figure it out ourselves and get ahead of it. So we did that in part by looking at our IRP, which is an integrated resource plan, which for SMUD in our region has an electrification focus on transportation and housing for the region. So just one thing to point out on here, well, two things actually, in kind of the dark blue. The percentage of EV sales by roughly 2025 is 30% in light duty. So that would be for the region, for Sacramento. There are some experts that are suggesting that for us to reduce our emissions on this curve, that the stakeholders or the people in our region would need to start purchasing vehicles at that rate. And you can see that rate accelerates over about a 10-year period to 100% of EV sales in light duty by 2035. And with all the options that are going to be coming online here from the market over the next couple of years, we think that that's likely a realistic path. And as the electric service provider and a fleet operator, we wanted to make investments in our fleet and demonstrate that activity. Hence the marketing and the image of the Chevy Bolt on our cover page, just showing that we're making efforts to be ahead of the curve. And then the last thing to point out here is 100% of truck sales are electric, hybrid, or CNG by 2040. Now that one's a little bit further out. We're still trying to figure out how we should interpret that trend or that path as fleet operators. There aren't as many options on the market just yet. But this is just something that our company rallied around, and we did our best to interpret as fleet operators. And the point here is we just wanted to be in the driver's seat in setting our own goals for fleet electrification. So the next slide has a couple kind of fun pictures on it just to demonstrate our path to electrification. We've made investments in fleet electrification going back to the 90s. A couple different things we did on our own, conversions from gas to electric. Some of those old school, or we were kind of joking earlier today about the throwback RAV4 EV. We had one of those in our fleet that ended up being recalled. And then the Miles vehicle, that was another kind of throwback, and some other modifications on pickup trucks to see what we could do around electrification. Go to the next slide. It gives us a few more examples of what we've done. Here recently, we had one hybrid drive line truck, which was not a very successful pilot, just not great performance or feedback from operators on that one. And then here recently, we've been working with Altec on the GEMS hybrid electric bucket truck solution, and that's been working fairly well for us. We're anticipating a new generation of that GEMS equipment. We've gone through two generations. The first generation was fairly smooth. The second generation had a couple hiccups. But we continue to partner with Altec very closely around that investment.
One thing, if you're not familiar with the GEMS system, or if you haven't heard that before, GEMS stands for Job Site Energy Management System. So basically, the GEMS package, the battery does not propel the truck, but it operates the boom, and then it provides the cab of the truck with heating and air conditioning. So it's basically a really good idle mitigation system for the truck.
And speaking of idle mitigation, that's kind of our latest aftermarket modification to advance the electrification, is to install some of those systems on vehicles to reduce idle time, just in general. So in combination, our hybrid bucket trucks, our idle mitigation systems, and then some equipment like forklifts and such that are eligible. We're trying to spend our capital in those areas to make some progress with fleet electrification.
So back to our yard and the charging infrastructure. Here's a picture of some charging that we put in. This is level 1 charging for our GEMS trucks. And our facilities department was, I don't know if I want to say smart or creative enough, but they were smart enough, creative enough to come up with a really good solution, since we weren't able to actually trench on the yard. As we came up with these plastic sand-filled K-rails. Now this is a temporary charging infrastructure, meaning it can be moved and redeployed throughout the yard in a different configuration as the fleet changes and the dynamics of the fleet. We don't anticipate doing that anytime soon, but it was a very cost-effective way to install some charging infrastructure.
Okay, I'll hit this one quick. I talked earlier about being in a position where we were able to set goals for ourselves. So this slide was just kind of putting the areas in our fleet where we could put some programs together that we could talk to R&D about, talk to operator groups about. This is really just kind of a simple one-page slide that helps coordinate the opportunities for fleet electrification. So at the top, there are some pilots that we've thought about. Of course, the bucket trucks, the GEM system that Jacob mentioned, idle mitigation. We've been doing light-duty EVs for a long time. Prior to the all-electric or the BEVs, we were doing plug-in hybrid electric. And then we see electric pickups coming online here pretty soon in the next couple of years. So this is really just a draft slide to show you kind of how we thought through setting some goals. We wanted to get our sedan fleet to nearly 100% by year-end 2020. We've thought about increasing our electrification on a percentage basis each year, and then we're trying to make some guesses on when, for all of the eligible fleet, when we can get that to be 100%. It's a bit of a moving target, but if we use this kind of roadmap and in this format, we can kind of think through it as a team and think through it with other stakeholders like R&D and facilities and such to help us get there. So we'll go to the next slide, which describes where we're going to continue to pursue fleet electrification. Of course, the Bolt is a great tool for us. Again, with the electric bucket trucks, we're really looking forward to seeing what comes out with the EV F-150, possibly rolling that into our pickup replacement schedule, and then aligning with the state goals for 2030, or maybe even being ahead of the state goals. You can go to the next slide, which is actually a repeat. So I think you can. Actually, we'll hit this one. This one's I think just in more detail about charging proposed for future years.
Yeah, so it's important. Some of the lessons learned with charging infrastructure is if you're ever building any new facilities, or even if you're going to update existing facilities, try to think, instead of like 3 to 5 years, try to think, 10 to 15 or 20 years out. So we've had some parking lots installed recently where we've had the contractor go ahead and place conduit strategically underneath the parking lot to begin with, that we anticipate maybe using, 5 or 10 years down the road. We just don't know as the industry changes and the charging options change. So whatever you do, you always want to just think long term. and kind of have a plan, and you won't be able to predict everything or be able to put all the pieces together, but you have to just start somewhere, and you just kind of have to jump in and just go for it.
These are lessons learned on fleet electrification. I think, Jacob, you spoke to some of them.
Yeah.
The fourth bullet point down was what I was trying to demonstrate, just getting out in front from a fleet perspective, try to control the conversation or set your own goals. And a couple other things to hit on here. Anything particular?
No. As far as the costs go, it is expensive to replace some batteries. We've had some issues on some units replacing batteries, getting warranty support. Just over the life of an electric vehicle, you're going to save some money in the maintenance up until that battery replacement. It can be quite costly, but just take that into consideration when you're looking at the complete life cycle of the unit. So we've had a few, but fortunately, it hasn't impacted us too bad.
So I think rolling back to some of the measures and metrics and just hitting back to the original outline of the webinar, I would measure the success in our fleet by maintaining and improving our utilization year over year, keeping the size of our fleet the same or reducing the size of the fleet. We've been able to reduce our backlog in work orders tremendously. We've kept our maintenance budget flat. We've kept our labor budget flat, and we are improving our fuel economy. The average age of our fleet is going down, and a number of other things that we showed you that list earlier on our scorecard. So I'm happy with the progress in our fleet, and I think we've got a number of success stories to tell just from all the KPIs and everything that we have. So with that, probably a good time to switch over to questions.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Casey and Jacob, for all that useful information. So I did want to spend the next 3 to 4 minutes to answer some questions that we received. For those that need to jump off the webinar, I did want to ask for your feedback. So make sure that you provide us with any thoughts to help us identify next topics or recommendations for improvement for our upcoming webinars next year. And you will all receive an email as soon as the webinar is over asking for your feedback. And we will also be sending out a recording of this webinar later next week to all of our participants. So watch out for that in your email. It'll also be available on the CSC CVRP YouTube webpage online. And one of the questions, I think we have time for 2 questions, so I'll go ahead and ask the first one. And for Jacob and Casey, have you considered looking into Cartograph for your work or order management, asset management?
I would assume that is a particular system like Maximo or any of the others. I'm not familiar with Cartograph. Are you?
No.
We'll have to take a look and see what that's all about.
All right, perfect. And the next question is also for Casey and Jacob. So do you have any suggestions for ways to ensure utility EV car sharing programs, specifically in multifamily locations?
Good question. That's a little bit advanced topic from where we are right now internally and how we're aligning to support that theme. There's a couple different ways that I think about that initially. One is just tracking the use and the assets themselves. We've been pretty successful in using Fleet Karma, which tracks utilization. It tracks charging, and in partnering with the vehicle share or charging infrastructure providers, I would imagine a solution like that could be pretty beneficial. On the other side of it, we do have an organization internally that is focused on sustainable communities, and we've just started talking about how we can either leverage our fleet assets or partner with other organizations to help with those mobility type questions in either underserved or economic development areas in our community. So I guess that was kind of a two-part answer for me, one operationally and then another one more kind of politically, if you will.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Casey and Jacob. Once again, we are out of time for questions, but I did want to say if we didn't provide an answer to your question, we will do so via email. I also encourage asking additional questions or comments through the online questionnaire we'll be sending out after this webinar. And once again, I want to thank you both, Casey and Jacob, for all the information you've shared. It's been really helpful, and I want to thank everyone for attending today, and have a great rest of your week.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.